ya la la ya 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 la 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 ya 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 la 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 ya la ya ay 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 ya la ay 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 Welcome everybody. Shabbat Shalom. So it's great to see you all here, and just in case you are still not a Zoom expert, you can open up your chat bar, and we're going to be trying to post all the words to the blessings in there if you need it. You can find that by clicking on a button on the periphery of your screen with 3 little dots and opening the chat. We will also be inviting you to add your questions and comments to the chat later on. So excited to welcome Shabbat with all of you, and also looking forward to a conversation between myself and our member David Greene, who is a First Amendment rights lawyer, and so we'll be having a conversation about freedom of speech and Jewish tradition, and how they resonate with each other and how they illuminate one another. And all, of course, in light of recent events. We are going to be recording this evening, so if you do not want to be on a recording, you can make yourself invisible, but if you are visible, then you're visible. So just be aware of that. And I'm going to just invite anybody who has Shabbat candles to get them ready, and I'm going to move this little camera over here so you can see as we light ours. And so we'll sing as we light, and then we'll say the blessings together. We're just going to go back to that melody, Hine Matov melody, and just sing it as a nigun while we're lighting. Yalla la yalla la la ya yalla la la yalla la yalla la yalla la ya ya yalla la la yalla ya ay ay yalla yalla la la yalla ya So you can scoop in the lights wherever you are. You can scoop it from my candles. You can scoop it from yours. You can scoop it from each other. We are all lights to each other. Take a deep breath. And release the week that is about to end. One more time. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav ציוונו להדליק נר של Shabbat. Shabbat Shalom. All right, and now I'd like to invite Douglas and Miriam to offer Shalom.
Shalom Aleichem.
Shalom Aleichem, Malachei Hasharet, Malachei Elyon. Melech Malachei Hamlachim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Shalom, Malachei Hashalom, Malachei Elyon. Melech Malachei Hamlachim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Baruch Hu Nila Shalom, Malachei Hashalom, Malachei Elyon. Melech Malachei Hamlachim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Tzedkem l'shalom, Malachei Hashalom, Malachei Elyon. Melech Malachei Hamlachim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu.
All right, so if you have some kind of fruit of the vine or other libation, now is the time to get it ready. Find your Kiddush materials. And because we're going to move quickly through these blessings, I am not going to invite you to unmute and speak aloud those blessings you want to put in here, but if you do want to write something in the chat, you're welcome to. What are the blessings that you're putting in the cup for us? And Miriam has put in the blessing there in Hebrew in the translation at least. And so we're gonna sprinkle, 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 sprinkle. Savri Chaverai L'chaim Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam Borei peri hagafen Amen. Clink. All right. I'm seeing some beautiful blessings turn up in the chat there. All right, so let's take a moment. This is the spot where we traditionally bless our children. And some of us may have children available right there that you can bless. Some of us may not. Some of us may have children that are in our hearts or at a distance, or other loved ones who aren't our children, but who are other people's children, who are our spouses, who are our parents, our siblings, our friends. So let's just take a moment. If you are with somebody, we're going to give you a minute or two to just give each other a blessing. And it might be something like, may you be blessed with health and safety and peace and whatever other things are you think they might need. If you are alone in your own space right now, I invite you to just kind of do this as a meditation and close your eyes and think of very particular people and send them very particular blessings. So we're going to do our blessings over here, and I'm going to disappear from view for a moment so we have a little privacy to do that, and then we'll all come back together. So go ahead, bless the people who are in your heart and in your home right now. Okay, so everybody's welcome to wrap up your blessings and return to our group. And if you have some kind of bread with you, you can get it at the ready. We have some here. We're going to lift our hands up first and cleanse them. So let's shake off whatever we don't want to take with us into Shabbat as we lift up the hands with the blessing. Al netilat yadayim, Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al netilat yadayim. Woo! Oh, look, and the challah appears. There it is. And you can reach right through your screen to put your hand right on this challah, or on your own if you have one there, or whatever kind of bread you got. Ready? Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamotzi lechem min haaretz. Amen. Tear and share. Okay. All right. Okay. Tearing, sharing, eating, munching. All right. I'm going to release my children to other things. This was a bit dry, this challah.
Yeah, have it. Careful, don't drop it.
All right. So, Shabbat Shalom, everybody. I'm going to ask you to bring into your hearts anyone who you know in need of healing. It may be that you need healing, or they need healing on a physical level. It might be on an emotional level, people who have had losses, people who are struggling with various, levels of distress, spiritual, emotional, intellectual, all of that. So take a moment, bring them into your heart. And so you can put names into the chat if you'd like. we're going to have a prayer for healing. And as that prayer is led, I'm going to read our healing list, which has a number of names on it. Some of our, close friends and family of our members, some of our members. We also have a list of names of people who are undocumented immigrants making their way through our country's painful immigration system, and being accompanied by members of Or Shalom. So those names are going to be read as well. All these are read aloud every Thursday morning at our Thursday morning minyan. And again, I'll be reading them as Douglas and Miriam lead us in the Mishaberach, and the words for that are already in the chat. So let me invite Douglas and Miriam when you're ready to lead us in a prayer for healing.
To make our lives a blessing, and let us say Amen. Mishaberach limotenu, makor habracha liavotenu. Bless those in need of healing with refuah shlema, the renewal of body, the renewal of spirit, and let us say Amen. The renewal of body, the renewal of spirit, and let us say Amen.
May all those who we named and all those who are in our hearts and who are in wider circles, who are in need of healing from COVID, from all kinds of suffering, may all of us who are in need receive healing. Amen. So we are in for a treat in just a few minutes. Let me just give you a preview of our plan, just again for those who maybe have joined us since we began. In a moment, I'm going to invite David Greene to join me in the spotlight as we discuss recent events and actually, I'll just read you the description of what we're doing. Social media platforms are, as we know, in the news, and the response of many of them to the January 6th insurrection seemed to some people long overdue, and to others it represented a worrisome precedent for curtailing free speech in our democracy. So tonight, Or Shalom member David Greene and I will be having a conversation about the legal and policy issues that arise from decisions from Facebook and Twitter, and also thinking about how those decisions and the freedom of speech more generally resonate and overlap with or are in tension with principles in Jewish tradition. So I'll just introduce David in a moment, and that's our preview for what's to come. Before we get there, we'll want to take a couple more ritual moments. We're going to say Kaddish in just a moment, which is the prayer for remembering those that we have loved and lost. And then after a few announcements, we'll move into our dialogue. So as we move towards Kaddish, I'll just read a poem that some of you may have heard. This is something I wrote for our member Louise Schneider right as she was about to pass from this world. And I was on Or Shalom's trip to Israel and Palestine at the time, and got a call from Rabbi Meira, who was on call, and who gave me the chance to know what was going on. And I called into the family, talked to Richard, and then ended up writing this. A poem for a soul on her way. I wonder when the bond is broken, the bond body to soul that keeps a person in one place at a time, one linear moment after another, when you are free of those bothersome constrictions, time and space. Will you in that moment be with everyone you have ever loved, in one instant, forever within them, as memory, as wise guiding intuition, as dream, as DNA, tracing yourself through bodies and minds no longer just your own? We do not know where you go. We cannot entirely follow. But to imagine that you will not be with us would be a mistake. Understandable, but inaccurate. You will be with us in ways we cannot undo. Ripples from your life and loves will move through us and through this world in ways we cannot fathom. Not that we won't miss you. We will miss the chance to make new memories, to share new moments, and to see your face open with laughter, to taste your curiosity and feel the comfort of your words and touch. And in our missing, you will make your way again into this world, unbound by the limits of mortal flesh. You will be a longing and a present absence that still we shall always love. If you are saying Kaddish this evening, you can find the words in the chat, and you can add names. Now, we don't want to get confused. These names now are Kaddish names. So some of you may have had recent losses. Some of you may be remembering more distant losses. If you have the Or Shalom Zoom Minyan Siddur printed out or on another screen nearby, it's on the words are on the final page, and they're going in the chat right now as well. And I'm going to just read for us our list of yard sites, those losses that happened in the first half of February in years gone by. Tonight we're remembering Barry Wildorf, Hans Friedstadt, Dawn Allen McIntyre, Mary Isham, Geraldine Satz, Doris Najar, Ron Glassman, Earl Weinstein, Clara Wolinski-Menduk, Rose Rachel Raskin, John Levin, Doris Bernstein, Yaakov Moore, Betty Levy, and Jacob Harry Levine. And again, if you have other names, you can put them in the chat now. And if you are saying Kaddish, I invite you to rise with me. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah, be'alma divrach yirutei v'yamlich malchutei, b'chayechon u'v'yomechon u'v'chayei d'chol Beit Yisrael, ba'agala u'v'zman kariv v'imru amen. Yehei shmei Rabbah mevorach le'olam u'lalmei almaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh v'yithadar v'yit'aleh v'yithalal shemei d'kudsha b'richu. La'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tushbachata v'nechemata da'amiran be'alma v'imru amen. Yehei shlama rabba min shemaya v'chaim tovim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'mromav hu yaseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'al kol yoshvei tevel v'imru amen. You may be seated. So a couple of words about what's coming up, and then we'll turn to our own centerpiece of the evening. So let's see. Next week on Friday, well, every week at 6 o'clock on Fridays, we have some kind of Shabbat gathering on Zoom. Next week, it'll be Shabbat Kulanu, where we really invite especially our kids and families to come and take some leadership. But everyone, all ages are welcome, and that'll be, again, 6 o'clock next Friday. Saturday, next weekend, the 13th, in the morning at 10 o'clock, we'll have our next embodied spiritual practice session, and our theme is searching for joy in troubling times. And so that's Saturday, not tomorrow, but a week from tomorrow. And we have begun a kind of crafting, knitting, etc. circle called Kvetch, Gvel, and Candy Craft, which is on the first and third Mondays of the month at 3:30. And don't forget to mark your calendars and save the date for the evening of February 25th, when we'll be having our Purim celebration with the Southside Jewish Collaborative. Our theme is the Brady Bunch. So get on your 70s style and or anything Purim and wacky, and plan on having some fun with us. And in anticipation of Purim, as you may know, it's a tradition on Purim that friends give gifts to each other, and that Or Shalom will send our members a gift, a mystery gift. It's a pretty good one this year. I'm excited about it, I have to say. And it is a fundraiser, and we need some funds. So I hope that all of you will be generous and honor each other and give to the community as you have this opportunity to participate in a mitzvah for Purim. And send a gift from you to whoever you choose in our community as a Purim gift. So with all of that, I'm going to now tell you a little more about David and invite him to share the spotlight with me. Let me get him here first. There we go. Hi, David. So nice to have you. Let me read my little blurb about you. So David Greene is the Civil Liberties Director at Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is a nonprofit organization that works to ensure that rights and freedoms are enhanced as technology grows. David leads EFT's First Amendment litigation and works on freedom of speech issues internationally. So we are so blessed that David is here with us, and just so looking forward to hearing from you, David, and I'll hand things to you to begin.
Well, thank you, Rabbi Katie. I'm really looking forward to this too, because I think, as I told you, I have lots of questions as well. Let me just I want to share with people why I asked Rabbi Katie to do this. And this is, so I do a lot of work. A lot of my work is on what we call content moderation, which is sort of watching and criticizing and making suggestions about the practices of all of the online intermediaries, and maybe most noticeably sort of the big dominant social media companies, and how they moderate content, how there's not a single person who just lets everything flow through their site without having some rules or some policies about it. And so we pay very close attention to that. And we look at this issue not just sort of in the US, but as it happens around the world. And so we've been really, really busy, leading up to the election, to the US election, and then afterwards, and then with the events on January 6th, where Twitter and Facebook and a lot of other sites suspended and then ultimately just got rid of President Trump's accounts. There was quite a whirlwind of talking about this, and I found that I was doing a lot of calls with the press and TV interviews and stuff like that, and thought, well, I really want to talk about this with my community as well. And then what really cemented for me was I did the Bay podcast, and one of the things that I said that they used in the piece was that I said, my free speech heart doesn't bleed when the world's most powerful man has a slightly harder time talking to his people, to try to explain why, in the big picture for me, Twitter's decision to take away Trump's account wasn't the most pressing free speech thing for me. And then I went on to explain after that. I said, but it was sort of scary to see what type of power this private company that's very unaccountable to people, it's not democratically accountable, what it has. So that little quote that I said, my free speech heart doesn't bleed, got a bit of play among the Trump community, and I opened my email the next day after the podcast was launched, and I had an email that said something like, "Figures, a Jew would say that." And I really thought to myself, as I told some other people, there were so many grammatical errors in the email that I wasn't actually sort of scared or affronted by it or anything like that. But I really started thinking, what would a Jew actually say? Like, if someone was going to speak as a Jew about freedom of speech, what would they say? And I realized I didn't know. And so I reached out to Rabbi Katie and said, I really want to talk about this. I'm actually quite curious about what a Jew would say about freedom of speech. I mean, I know I do what I do, but I've never really thought about, aside from just being like, well, I'm a progressive person and a progressive Jew, I hadn't really thought about sort of how it fits into a larger frame of Jewish tradition and Jewish thinking. So that's why I'm here.
So glad. So, well, I would love to begin to explore that question by just first getting a little more clarity about what is free speech anyway, and thinking about that legally, and what are the why do we have this concern with the free speech rights, and so just starting there with sort of definition of terms, and as I'll just say to everyone who's tuning in that if you have a question, you can put it in the chat. We won't promise to answer it or address it right away, but from time to time we may look to the chat to enhance our conversation. So David, just tell us, what is this free speech anyway? What does it mean?
Yeah, it's actually a harder question, a harder question to answer that one might think. And I was trying to actually think, I wonder what the equivalent question I would ask a rabbi, where you would say, well, it depends. On
one hand.
But so there's two ways you can answer the question. One is the very sort of legal formalistic way, which freedom of speech is the rights that you are, the speech right that you are guaranteed by law. And so you could talk about freedom of speech, saying you're denied freedom of speech when the state acts to restrict what you can say or what you can read or listen to. The other way to talk about it is much more broadly, and which is also which I use a lot, is just talk about free speech principles more broadly, not tethered to any single legal system, to the US legal system or any other legal system. Just the idea that there is value in generally wanting everyone to have the ability to speak, to have the freedom and the autonomy, both to express those ideas and really sort of more deeply to develop those ideas, because one of the values in expressing them is actually acknowledging that people there's great value in people have the ability to express their ideas. So I think those are the two good working definitions of freedom of speech.
Mm-hmm. When that second point you made really does resonate for me Jewishly. I think that when you think about the structure of how Jewish law is presented traditionally in the Talmud, you have this structural recognition that there can be value in having multiple points of view, and having those points of view considered and in tension with each other and informing each other. You can see that on a Talmud page by seeing, it's almost like the hyperlinking before there was the internet. You have texts that are put together from different rabbis from different time periods discussing questions, and then you have a periphery of commentary that are commenting on particular words or terms or phrases, and what you're presented with is this marketplace of ideas, this multiplicity of ideas that is understood to be richer, because when we receive it, we aren't just receiving a monolithic, singular, dogmatic idea of truth or, ethical behavior. It's a multiplicity. So
it's interesting because the marketplace of ideas is putting this sort of market model on speech, with the idea that if we allow everyone to speak, the worthy ideas will be elevated and the bad ideas will be culled. Was really foundational in the development of First Amendment jurisprudence in the U.S. And really, it sort of comes maybe from the Scottish Enlightenment. So it was very sort of influential all around sort of the development of free speech principles of English common law. And I'm personally, it's not my favorite free speech principle. It's not like the one that keeps going. I'm much more into free speech as a way, freedom of speech for me. Overriding principle is one of really having the ability as a check on power and allowing, making sure those who are without voice can have voice and participate in society. But I really think a lot of the events we saw around January 6th in some ways are a really good example of sort of this market model in operation.
Mm-hmm. And so say a little more on this, about this, the way that free speech protections function to be a check on power, and how, it strikes me that maybe that's part of why your free speech heart didn't bleed in this case, right? So, is free speech something that, why do we have to protect the powerful, the free speech of the powerful, if the whole point is just to use free speech as a way to check power itself? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think, most of the vast majority of I've been doing this work for 25 years, and the vast majority of my time I've really represented, I've done free speech work on behalf of social movements and disadvantaged people, and people who I've been a public interest lawyer for most of my career, so people who can't afford to hire lawyers. And so my perspective really completely comes from the position of that for every difficult free speech question, for every type of speech that you personally abhor, I think all of us really think maybe that shouldn't be protected. You always have to ask ourselves, what power do we want to hand the state? Do we want, for example, right now, misinformation, false speech, under US law, most of false speech is actually has a fairly strong constitutional protection. And we ask why. What is that? Why is that? Was there social value to doing that? From my perspective, what we see is that when you hand the state the power to punish false speech, they use that power to punish dissent. They call every criticism against them false speech and propaganda, and they use that. So anytime that tool is given to the state, the power to punish false statements, it's manipulated by the state to suppress dissent. And if you look at the way U.S. law developed, that's exactly why the protections in U.S. law for false statements developed. It was in response to the southern states, especially Alabama, trying to suppress social movements, trying to suppress the NAACP and the civil and the Southern Leadership Conference, their social activism, by every time they would even make a small mistake, in their advocacy, call someone by the wrong name, or say that Martin Luther King was arrested 7 times, we'd only been arrested 5. Every time they made anything, or they said something like, we think these commissioners are corrupt, they would be, lawsuits piled upon them and would bankrupt them. And our legal protections for false statements, realize that giving the state that power So that's how I see that. To me, that's a really good example. The consequences that we have is that the state hasn't have a great ability to punish false speech, but that I think that's actually a good thing. It can be frustrating on a day-to-day basis, and we end up saying that there need to be now non-state actors who have to respond to false statements instead.
Mm-hmm. And so, what your example is making me wonder if, the Alabama example. So, have things evolved and has free speech become more protected since then, or is it still the case that there is just this tendency among powerful government entities to use these kinds of lawsuits to harass people or organizations and things like that?
We do okay in this country. We have a robust free speech regime, and that really has actually served as a check on governmental power. And I actually really think it's one of the things that got us through the last 4 years. Given the way Trump, when he was president, lashed out at the press. I mean, the only thing he could do within his power was to lash out at them. And everything he attempted to do otherwise, whether it was to kick certain reporters out of the press room, or just to, try to deny privileges to the Washington Post, particularly didn't like, or CNN, tried to threaten CNN. He actually couldn't do because we had these robust protections. You really contrast that with the rest of the world. I mean, just yesterday, Myanmar turned off after the coup, one of the first things they did was shut down Twitter and Facebook in Myanmar. That's really common. If you look at any non-democratic country around the world, one of their major tools is controlling the media and punishing dissenters' speech. So, I mean, it's happening in Myanmar right now. It happened in Uganda in the lead up to the elections there. It happens in India, it happens in Egypt. I mean, it happens.
Yeah, and so, and that leads me to another question, which is, do you think that free speech rights apply differently to a person talking on a street corner versus a newspaper or publishing house versus social media? Are there important differences in all of those different platforms and avenues for how free speech plays out?
Yeah, so doctrinally, there's no difference, and that can be a bit controversial, especially among sort of a lefty crowd that doesn't like the idea of corporate personhood. But I think for me, it's not that controversial because I really have come at this. When I first started doing free speech work, I was doing it on behalf of artists and the avant-garde arts community. And a lot of my work was really working with artist collective and arts organizations. Then I started doing a lot of work with activist organizations. And then I started doing a lot of work with journalists and press organizations. And all the time I was doing advocacy and legal work on behalf of collections of people, and very rarely of one single person. And if I had to draw a line between the speech rights of an individual as opposed to speech rights of collections of individuals, whether they were a community organization or a corporate entity like a newspaper, I couldn't do that. Everything was as important. I completely understand that the more corporate and crass the corporation gets, the less sympathetic it is, and that's fine. I think, and you think about, well, is there a limit somewhere? But I think generally, I think it's important that that entities have be acknowledged to have free speech rights as well. And it's not just a doctrinal thing. Actually, that's ultimately most beneficial for us as well, even if we're not talking about the law.
And so, this kind of getting back to the first question I asked and then touching on these different platforms. So what about the argument that I think has been prominent over these past number of years among circles on the right that would say that this cancel culture is, violating free speech. When Facebook or Twitter or any of these platforms, or a publishing house or a newspaper for that matter, decides not to allow something to be amplified, is that a restriction of free speech?
Yeah, so the best answer is no, right?
That's the answer I wanted to hear, but
It's certainly not a legal restriction of free speech. Because again, it's not the state saying you can't publish. I think if you're concerned about free speech principles really broadly, you could say, well, I want to see how someone is being silenced. But to me, one of the ironies, besides the whole like snowflake irony, like, oh yeah, look at the snowflakes now who like don't like people being, besides all of that, one of the ironies is that, the marketplace of ideas is essentially essentially a conservative, every market model is essentially sort of a conservative approach to something.
Based on the idolatry of worshiping the market as if it
Yeah.
had an ethical core.
And so the marketplace of ideas, which entered U.S. law with Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was by no liberal, he was really pushed along by lots of Jews, by Louis Brandeis and a lot of the Jewish thinkers at the time. But he was certainly he did not come at this from he was sort of living and on the court in the age of progressives, and he was no progressive. So it's essentially, but this is sort of an example of it, right? The marketplace of ideas is based on the idea that bad ideas are cold, right? And so if you're going to accept the marketplace, you have to accept that maybe your ideas are rejected by everybody. The important question we should ask is, who's doing the rejection? Is the market, which is such an awful way of thinking about it, right? Are those who are rejecting it, is it actually being is it actually being rejected sort of by enough voices, right? Or is there some dominant person rejecting it, and that we need to be concerned about that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when we were talking before this, I think I was pushing you a little bit on this point and asking you, well, these days aren't the tech companies the powers that be, and is there some important way in which we should have this right in that context, instead of just freedom from being punished by the government for some kind of speech? Shouldn't that extend to other powerful actors, not just the government, also these big powerful tech companies? And you kind of explained something important to me about, no, actually, there is a difference between Facebook and the government. And would you just kind of go over that? I think was
I find, as I've been talking about this tends to be one of the most controversial things I tend to say. But to me, the legal question of whether Facebook or Twitter or Switch or Amazon Web Services, right, can be required to carry somebody's speech is an easy one. There's a caveat to that, but it's essentially an easy one, because I think, no, they are private entities, right? And they actually themselves have, the way newspapers have a First Amendment right to edit their sites, and the way art museums have a First Amendment right to curate their collections. These sites have a right to edit and curate what you see, their sites. It's a little bit more compelling an argument for like a social media company that, that you interact with directly. This or something sort of like a deep internet service like Amazon Web Services you might not even know exist. But they have a right to do that, and that's actually that's under U.S. law. That's a really easy legal question, and I think that's the right answer, because if you flip it around, what you're essentially saying, if they don't have that right, then the government has the right to force them to carry the messages the government wants them to carry. And I think we really saw this with, if Twitter and Facebook and all the other services that did this did not have the right to say, Trump and other people who we think are fomenting violence, fomenting insurrection, if the government had the ability to require them, like they said, we don't want you on our site. If the government had the ability, what you're otherwise saying is the government has the ability to force them to say, no, you are going to carry and to tell everybody what my supporters are saying and what my favored message is. And that's a really, really scary power.
Yes, like to say, oh, this is the president and Twitter, you can't, no rules apply because he's the president, you have to broadcast everything he says.
Yeah, and that's to me, that's a really, I don't want the state to have the power to force someone to have to carry the state's preferred message. Mm-hmm. So and actually it's really hard to separate that power from then giving the power of the state to exclude messages it doesn't like. I mean, those are the same thing. I also say I actually think it's best for us too, the idea that Facebook, as awful as it might be, as it is, has this right to curate its site, is actually to our benefit ultimately. Now, we might not like how it does it, right? And we might want to demand accountability from them and want them to change and want them to be more consistent, want their decisions to be understandable and make sense. Like, that's all fine. But that has a legal right to do it, I think, is important because we, they want nobody, there's really no internet service exists that is just going to say, I'm just going to comply with the law and everything legal gets to go and everything legal doesn't get to go. Maybe nobody wants to do that. There's really no one who wants a lot, like, First Amendment protected sexual speech and imagery on their site, even though it's protected by law. That's just not how they see their site, right? Or harassing speech, or name whatever the thing it is that someone doesn't want. I think we as users are actually better served by having sites do that work if they want to do it. Now, we want to know what they're going to do. Like, we don't want it to be hidden from us. Like, we want to know what their policies are and what they like and what they don't like. But I think it's important that I think just for us as internet users, it's important that they actually have the legal ability to do that. I mean, some sites actually want to be very specialized. Pinterest has a very narrow focus, and it should have a legal right to have that narrow. Mm-hmm. It should have that narrow focus. Dating sites that want to appeal just to certain populations should have the ability to do that and not be required to. No, everyone has to date on your site. A lot of these things I think just make sense at a certain level with how we interact. Mm-hmm.
And so I have a sort of a two-part question then. So, and I saw a question come up in the chat now as well, and please excuse the airplane flying over my house. So are there limits to legal free speech? And if so, what are they? And what you've said so far, and what I understand from looking around, is that those limits are fairly weak and fairly, limited to a certain small number of cases. It does not include a lot of really offensive, horrible stuff. And so the first question is, what are those limits? Are there limits? What are they? And the second is, okay, if those limits aren't enough to take care of incitement and disinformation and hate speech and all this other stuff going on, what's the solution then? If, what are we supposed to do about it?
So
David, just tell us,
limits.
Please.
Free speech is not an absolute right, not in the US or really any place, any legal system in the world. And really has never been. There's never been a legal system that's had an absolute right to freedom of speech. So under US law, there's sort of two types of limitations on free speech. One is what we call categorical limitations. There's certain types of speech that just categorically are excluded from legal protection. And then there's this other area called, even if speech is protected, the government still has the ability to regulate it. And we have, and then there's a whole bunch of these ends means balancing tests that, depending on what the government's trying to do, might apply. And in fact, we actually have lots of limits on free speech in the US. Some numbers are very sensible. You can't, if you were sworn under oath and you lie, you can be convicted of perjury. I mean, one we're very familiar with that, so there's no free speech problem with that. And then there are categories, so these categories of speech that are unprotected include obscenity. So it's at some point sexual expression is not protected by the First Amendment. There's this idea of true threats of violence. So if you speak in a manner to put someone in a fear for their personal safety or their life, and that's your intent to do so, and you clearly intended to, it's a very, the test has made, at some point though, that speech is not protected. And there is incitement. It is a term that describes a category of speech that's not protected. It's a much more narrow category that I think most people realize. I think, the question, the example that always gets given is the example that for free speech lawyers sort of like, makes our skin crawl, because it actually is completely legal to falsely shout fire in a crowded theater. That does actually not describe it. That does not describe what incitement is under U.S. law. Okay. Anyway, there are limitations.
And then so let's just say those limitations are such that it's perfectly legal to publish a book that says horrible things about Jews. Like, this is something, I mean, one of the things that's really been striking to me as a rabbi and scholar of Jewish history to some extent, is just to see what's happening with this QAnon phenomenon, and to think about how those tropes, those accusations are so old and rooted in these lies that have been told about the Jewish people through hundreds of years, and in the form of something called the blood libel, which is this falsehood that has popped up throughout history, imagining Jewish people doing horrible, bloody, cannibalistic, awful things that is just the farthest thing from any Jewish practice ever. And so, I'm betting that it's legal to publish a book about blood libel in this country. So then what do we do about that sort of thing?
Yeah.
Is there a legal remedy, or is this beyond legality and law and enforcement in terms of the American way to deal with it?
Yeah. So as a very general matter under U.S. law, offensive speech, even highly offensive speech, is protected speech. And again, that's because of recognition of, we don't want to hand the government we don't want to hand the state the power to determine what's offensive. That's a very awful power to hand the state. But the result is that a lot of really horrible speech about Jews and about lots of other populations is protected. So we really then have to look for what other remedies do we have, what other non-legal remedies, how we do this. And this puts a huge burden both on the people who are being talked about, as well as sort of civil society and right. other types of structures. And I completely understand, like, it makes it a lot of work. And that's what it is. And really, even there's some example, if you even go internationally, there's a bit of a difference. It's not quite as great, I think, as people think. There are some specific places like Germany which specifically call out sort of Holocaust denial and things like that are illegal. But things are largely unprotected, and we really have to look to sort of other institutions to respond to those. And for those of us who are in the community who are subject to this stuff, that's a great burden, and often a really unsatisfying answer. Mm-hmm. I can say, one of the examples we always like to give, I was actually just reading, so we're writing something right now about a new law in Indonesia that is restricting this stuff. And we're reading a lot of sort of the research that's been done, but if you really look at just to prove, if people doubt that hate speech laws are actually used to oppress people, so a lot of the ways that Muslims are punished in places like France, which actually has fairly restrictive laws on hate speech, is under hate speech laws, is that their speech is hateful of non-Muslims. And we actually do see countries that have hate speech laws. We actually do see those laws being used to oppress people. So it's not a hypothetical.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to just say one word about the Jewish approach, and then I was thinking I would turn to the chat to mine some of the questions and comments that people have been making, if that's okay with you.
Yeah.
One thing to note about the way that Jewish law works is that the American system is built around a number of principles, including rights. And the Jewish legal system doesn't have a concept that maps easily onto rights. There are prohibitions, there are obligations, there are commandments, right? And so I wish I could answer well this question that just came up: what Talmudic texts speak most directly to free speech? I'm not enough of a broad Talmudic scholar and free speech expert to answer that well. But a part of why is because of this structure that there isn't some sort of Jewish right to this or a Jewish right to that. But there are these value concepts which are at play with issues such as that. For example, the most sacred value of all of preserving human life. That value trumps all other principles. So I would imagine that if you were to have a debate about a piece of offensive speech that led to some harm that resulted in death, I suspect that would be a problem in American law, definitely would be a problem in Jewish law. And, as I was poking around, let me just find my notes here. A couple of things that I found that I think are of note. I was reading an article on incitement in Jewish law and American Anglo law, and one of the important principles that I wanted to lift up was that in Jewish law there's a recognition that there are different categories of people who have different levels of power, and therefore there are different legal expectations. So, for example, a person who's just sort of an ordinary day-to-day person with no particular societal power or office has a lot more space to say to other people, "This is the law, and you should do this." But if you have a scholar who is a respected legal authority, and that person says, "This is legal, you should do this," but they're actually lying, they're actually leading people astray, that is called a zaken mamre, which is a rebellious elder. And that person gets a much more severe punishment than the ordinary person who commits such an act. And so, that's just one little piece from the Jewish tradition, is to think about not just this overarching right, but sort of who is speaking and what is the impact of that speech, and how does that not just impact one situation, but maybe the idea of setting precedents and leading others astray in the future becomes important. I have no idea if is there anything like that American-wise?
No, there's not. In fact, there's almost the opposite, where anytime there's an effort made to really try to distinguish among speakers, that gets rejected. And there is this idea that that we're not going to impose greater restrictions on people just because they find themselves in a position of power. There's a bit of an exception. What we do the other way around is that, for example, like in defamation, like if somebody is saying, well, a false statement damaged my reputation, that famous people who are the targets actually have a much harder time winning those cases. So they actually have, so it's sort of the other way around, where they are denied, they have sort of lesser rights or more disadvantages to trying to sort of recover for an injury to their reputation. But we don't have something where we treat the speakers differently. We give greater protections to people who aren't famous in terms of trying to address the harm than we do for those who are.
Mm-hmm. So, David, I don't know if you saw there. So, Tom and Sarah Lee had a question, which looks like it brings in another person's thinking that I'm not familiar with.
Yeah, I've actually so the Tom and Sarah Lee asked about, so Shoshana Zuboff had a column. So she's been writing about, from Shoshana Zuboff, who's at Harvard, has been writing about this idea of surveillance capitalism, how these big social media companies really exist just to gather information and monetize information about all of us. And I think that's generally correct. And she had a big piece in the Sunday Times, and I had a lot of people ask me my response, and generally my response has been, oh, my colleague Cory Doctorow has written a great response to this, and I've been giving them the link. And I can't do that right now. Let me just say that in some ways I completely agree with her. I think where we disagree is on what the remedy is. I think if our problem is with the way these companies have acquired their assets and their power, I think there's a ways we can address that. And I very much support data privacy restrictions, and even thinking about what in the structure of the internet has led to them being able to in a position to accumulate so much information and monetize it in a way that doesn't seem to be within the interest of the users. And one of the things we like to talk about as a remedy, instead of what she suggests, which is really sort of regulating them as sort of very sort of heavy regulation on how they exist, is what we call sort of federating the internet, the idea that that you are not sort of bound to a single service, and if you want to communicate with people and have your information kept someplace, that so your ability to do that sort of interoperable among one system. So if you have a Facebook account, but you want to talk to someone with a Twitter account, you would be able to do that. You wouldn't just be locked in. That's not a great example because they're sort of different services, but you'd be able to do that. I think the closest example I give to people is text messaging, right? It doesn't matter what text message, if SMS, it doesn't matter what SMS you have on your phone. You're going to be able to communicate with someone who uses SMS, even if they have like a different app on their phone to do it. There's other type of messaging which is different, and so something like that, would, and the more choices we have, and the more ability we have, to more control we have over our data and our use of what we use, I think that would address a lot of what she talks about. And she talks about surveillance capitalism. We call this at EFF, we call this competitive compatibility. If you want to read more about it, there's lots of stuff on our website about it.
I'm seeing one other question, which I have a sort of rabbinical answer to, and maybe you have a lawyerly answer to, about what about giving legal or financial advice as a lawyer or accredited financial advisor, and what that is, what I'm imagining is that touches on, at least to me, this idea that there are other structures available to create culture and accountability that are not just the legal system. So, for example, in my profession and in David's profession, we have professional organizations that license us, that give us titles, that give us certain status and professional. We have professional groups that hold us accountable, that have ethical standards and so on. And those, there are times when those overlap with legal guidelines, but then there are times when the ethical standards of a professional group are a higher standard than the legal standard. So, you may be legally able to say something as a rabbi that is legal, but it could be so unethical to say such a thing, and to use speech in a certain way that you're, if I were to say I can't imagine what it would be, but if I were to to use speech in a way that was damaging to a person profoundly, my professional organization might take action and strip me of my title and my status, even if it was legal for me to say such a thing. And that's part of, my answer to my own question of, well, what do we do about these, if we don't want to restrict free speech legally because we're worried about the government having too much power, then how do we deal with it? And that's one way. And that's one of the things that's available to us, are these civil society professional organizations with ethical standards that do not have to be just about legality. So I don't know if there are other pieces to add there.
Yeah, well, no, I think that's right. So there's 2 points I want to try and make really briefly. One is that there are certain people who the law recognizes have greater obligations to the people they're serving. So we say they have fiduciary duties to certain people, and if they break that duty, there actually could be legal consequences to that. And there is a concept that some academics are batting around with, this idea, well, maybe we should treat these big social media companies as information fiduciaries. And that they have obligation. This is more sort of in the data privacy part than in the speech part, but maybe they have we should impose some type of enforceable obligations on them, the way they handle people's information. Mm-hmm. But I think that, to me, that's an academic debate that's happening right now. I think there's also a really interesting thing that I think we actually saw play out January 6th, which is that whenever our institutions can't help us, our governmental institutions can't help us, either because they legally are limited doing so, or just because they're incompetent, or their values are wrong, or they're evil, we really look to others to fill that gap. Mm-hmm. And I think for a lot of people on January 6th, they looked to Twitter to shut the president up. And that wasn't because they love Twitter or because they love the fact that Twitter has so much power. It's just because it was the only thing that they thought could help at that point. And so, and we see this, there's actually a book that's going to come out about this, that not me, but someone else very smart is writing. But so you see this all the time. You see these things where what institutions, what non-governmental institutions do we look for when government either fails or does not have the ability to respond to something that's concerning? And I think we actually ended up on that day looking to Facebook and Twitter, who we might actually hate, and looking at them like, you're the ones who have the power to do something and you need to do something. They don't have a legal obligation to do so, but they had the legal ability to react. Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, one of the reasons it's important to at least say that even these big companies who I really dislike need to have the ability to take action when sort of society needs them to do so.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and what it makes me think about is that we, never mind. I just got distracted by the chat. I should stop looking at the chat when I open my mouth. Anyhow, but it does remind me, I think we should wrap in about 5 minutes. So there are a couple comments coming up here in the chat, which I got distracted by. And they're wonderful comments, worthy of distraction. So folks talking about this week's Parsha, which is such a great, very juicy Torah portion. The first...
What's my daughter's bat mitzvah portion?
Oh, what a Parsha! The Parshat Yitro, which includes the 10 commandments and the commandment against taking the Lord's name in vain. So there are a couple comments here in the chat about that and different interpretations of what that means. And Margot here is saying that in the 10 commandments, there's not a prohibition against lying per se. There are other places in the Torah which very clearly say you are not allowed to lie. There is a prohibition in the mitzvot, in the basic Torah Jewish law, that you are not supposed to lie. And in the Ten Commandments, that just has these two valences. One is not taking the Lord's name in vain, and one is not to swear falsely in court, bearing false witness. So those are the two versions of it. There's also another really interesting twist that happens in Jewish law, which is that in the Ten Commandments you have thou shalt not steal, and later in Jewish law there becomes a sort of a legal discussion which figures out a way to put the prohibition against lying into the Ten Commandments. And this is how they do it. They say, when you lie or deceive somebody, you are committing a sin called genivat da'at. You are stealing their mind. When you lie to someone, you are violating one of the Ten Commandments. You're violating the commandment not to steal, because by deceiving somebody, you are stealing their mind. So it's really kind of fascinating way that to me, when I saw that development, what it said to me was our sages over time felt like there was a gap in the Ten Commandments, that it should have said, thou shalt not lie. It didn't say that. So how can we figure out how to make the Ten Commandments mean what we think it should mean? And so that was one strategy. All right. So, David, do you have any kind of closing thoughts for us before we say Shabbat Shalom to everyone?
I don't know if I have closing thoughts. I'm still, as I was looking into this, as I sort of started talking to Rabbi Katie about it, I just started looking into myself, like, well, what do Jews think about freedom of speech? I just thought it was really interesting how to see, I think, sort of both aspects, both the idea there's all this sort of obligations in Judaism to call out injustice and to speak out about injustice and not be silent when you see it. And we want to have legal structures that protect people's ability to do that. And then as well as sort of all these prohibitions on gossip and false, and certain false statements and harming people with your speech and things like that, it makes me realize that we've been, struggling with the it's in some ways heartening to see, right, that that everyone's been struggling with these issues, that religions and cultures that are thousands of years old have been struggling with this sort of duality of protecting someone's right to speak.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I remembered my thought. I'll wrap up things a little bit and say one more thank you. The thought that I lost and reacquired was, just going back to this idea of the importance of non-governmental solutions to these kinds of things. If we want to deal with hate speech and disinformation and incitement, and all of incitement maybe has some legal remedies, but so much of what we are really having trouble with these days is stuff that should remain legal for all the reasons you've laid out, and yet we have to do something about it. And really, I think a lot does end up coming back to these non-governmental institutions that create ethical cultures and standards and accountability. And that's a point that was made by Timothy Snyder in his book on tyranny that I think is so important and everyone should read. Those institutions where professionals have accountability to moral standards, ethical standards that are not just in the governmental legal system, become really important ways where people succeed in resisting tyranny. That, medical professionals, legal professionals, clergy members who have accountability to each other and to standards of their professions may have ways to do good and resist oppression and resist becoming oppressors because of those organizations. And so, one of the things I hope for all of us as members of a community that are such an organization, we are a community of people who are sharing values, who have moral and ethical vision, who are learning how to make that real in the world and how to hold each other and ourselves accountable to those standards. Part of what Or Shalom is about, and what the wider Jewish community is about figuring out how to live more fully into those values of not just making our speech legal, but making it ethical. Figuring out the ways that we speak are. We know that speech is powerful. We know that according to Jewish tradition, the whole world was created from speech. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. The power of speech is understood Jewishly to be really, really profound. And so if we want our speech to be holy, that's a standard that the United States is not going to hold up in our legal system, but we can aspire to it as Jews. So maybe that's part of the the answer to your first question there, of aspiring to holy speech, not just legal free speech. So David, thank you. What a treat.
Thank you. This was wonderful for me.
Yeah. So just such a thought-provoking conversation, and thank you for just reaching out about it and making the time. And I think we're all so enriched. And as I said, I've recorded this. I will post it. People can share it with others, and hope that we'll have a chance maybe to do this again with another topic. And thank you, everybody. So I'm going to close with a song, and we will leave it there. So, all right, I'm gonna choose to end with Ozi V'Zimrat Yatz, one of our favorites, and if we can get in the chat, great. If not, a lot of you know it. Ozi, my strength, V'Zimrat Ya. Oh, good job, Miriam. Thank you. Ozi V'Zimrat Ya, my strength, and the song of God, Vayhi Lishua, will be my salvation. So the ways that I effort and strive, and the ways that I just find God in the universe answering back, those two elements will save us. Ozi V'Zimrat Ya. Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Stay healthy, stay safe. Mazel Tov if you've had a vaccination already. Patience if you haven't yet. There will be an end to all this, and we'll be back in person and doing this in the same room soon enough. And in the meantime, I hope everybody stays well. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.